to. Minister, we have a request because of the makeup of committee now. It's the official opposition is 4 members. They'd all like to get on. Is it possible to stay 10 minutes longer?
There are 4. I think I see 5.
Yeah, but there's only 4 going to ask questions.
Okay. Who's not going to ask questions?
You count correctly.
Pat's not asking questions? Well, on that basis, yes. I mean, had it been Pat, I think the answer would have been a clear no.
You too, Mr. Minister, let it keep your remarks pretty tight. So, okay, with that, we will go to the Minister for your opening statement, and thank you very much for coming, Minister. We look forward to an informative session. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you, and as you can see, I have some colleagues from the Finance Department here with me, so if there are questions that any of you would prefer to send their way, I'm obviously happy to acquiesce. So good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members of this committee. Merci de m'avoir invité.
Thank you for having invited me to come and speak before you today. I congratulate you and I thank you for the work that you have accomplished in the framework of your own pre-budgetary consultations.
Budget. I think the first thing that we need to think about is where we are right now and how we got there. As shown in our latest economic and fiscal update in December, our economy is doing well and continues to grow at a good pace. In fact, we're on track to have the second fastest growing economy in the G7 this year. Depuis 2015, le travail acharné des Canadiens.
Since 2015, the hard work of Canadians supported by investments has made it possible to create more than 1 million jobs, most of them full-time jobs. The unemployment rate stands at a historic low. Companies' profits are substantial, and salaries and wages are increasing.
From continuing protectionism around the world to the near-term challenges raised by coronavirus. Overall, Canada's net debt to GDP ratio remains the lowest among G7 countries, keeping our country in an enviable position among our peers. Our relatively low level of debt is a major competitive advantage, and we as a government remain fully committed to maintaining it in an unpredictable world. Around the world, we've also seen the easing of trade tensions between the U.S. and China. At home, we're calling for all parliamentarians to support swift passage of the new NAFTA, the CUSMA agreement. It's a good deal for Canadians, and it will bring more certainty for us in our trade with our most important partner. We want to build on the progress of the last 4 years in a way that's responsible and that makes a real difference in the lives of Canadians and sets us up for the future.
We must continue investing in Canadians and encouraging economic growth while remaining financially responsible.
Continue moving forward with our plan to strengthen and grow the middle class, make life more affordable, and prepare Canada for the future. Our parliamentary priority when the 43rd Parliament opened was to introduce a proposal to lower taxes. This proposal would raise the basic personal amount to $15,000 by 2023 and lower taxes for close to 20 million Canadians. By 2023, single individuals could save close to $300 in taxes each year, while families, including those led by a single parent, could save nearly $600 per year in taxes. About 1 million more Canadians will no longer pay taxes, federal income taxes, in 2023 on this basis. To ensure that this tax relief goes to the people that need it most, we are also planning on phasing out the benefits of the increased basic personal amount for wealthy individuals. This proposal, combined with measures like the Canada Child Benefit and middle-class tax cut introduced by our government, would see a typical family of 4 be better off more than $2,300 this year compared to 2015. Once the proposed increase in the basic personal amount is fully phased in 2023, this family will be better off by more than $2,800 every year. Nous savons que le budget fédéral de cette année.
We know that this year's federal budget will be an opportunity for us to bring in other measures that will improve people's lives throughout the country. In order to do this, we invite all Canadians to express their ideas on how we can go about continuing to ensure the growth of the middle class and of the economy. As you are aware, Canada's Finance Department holds consultations every year, pre-budgetary consultations, alongside the important work done by your committee. These consultations enable us to interact directly and openly with the largest possible number of Canadians, in particular, stakeholders and leaders in the community, to make sure that their viewpoints may be taken into consideration in the process of preparing the 2020 budget. My colleagues, Minister Fortier, Parliamentary Secretary Fraser, and myself have launched our pre-budgetary consultations on January 13th, and since then, we have organized roundtables and discussion sessions that are open throughout the country. During these consultations, we have been hearing directly what Canadians have to say to us about the subjects of most concern to them. I organized an open discussion in my riding and 2 roundtables in the Canadian West, in Vancouver and in Calgary, where I had the opportunity to hear comments from young people, business leaders, and community leaders concerning their priorities regarding the 2020 federal budget. Canadians also expressed their priorities concerning the 2020 budget by email, mail, online surveys, and at roundtables. This year, the pre-budget consultations have been focusing on points that we are aware of that are important to Canadians: strengthening the middle class, protecting the environment, maintaining health and security of Canadians, and continuing reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. Through these consultations, Canadians are able to express themselves on topics such as the following: what works best and what concerns them? What can we do to continue to make the cost of living more affordable? How can we create more good jobs that are well paid? How can we continue to strengthen the middle class? What can the government do to deal with climate change? What can we do to ensure the security of our communities? What measures can we adopt in order to improve reconciliation? How can we build a more viable future for everyone? Since Monday, we have been reading comments from more than 18,000 Canadians through our online survey. And the questions in the survey are drawn from 4 themes that I mentioned earlier. Canadians have up until February 21st to send in their ideas before we end the consultation period.
Work has been focused on the theme of our transition to a low-carbon economy, and I want to take a moment to outline the work that our government's doing. Notre gouvernement a présenté le tout premier plan national canadien en matière de changement.
Concerning climate change, we have heard what Canadians think, and since then we've made targeted investments to build an economy with a low carbon footprint. This includes investments in energy efficiency for households, schools, hospitals, universities, municipalities, Indigenous communities, businesses, and many more. These projects will contribute to reducing greenhouse gas emissions and enable Canadians to reduce their energy bills.
Public transit, helping reduce pollution and congestion. We're also investing in renewables, in clean tech, and giving business incentives to find innovative ways to reduce their emissions. As the low-carbon economy grows, we're making sure to attract and create the jobs of the future here in Canada. We'll keep working to reduce emissions and to grow the economy. As we prepare Budget 2020, we'll take the ideas of Canadians, put them towards our work to build an economy that works for everyone, that keeps Canadians safe and healthy, that protects our environment, and moves Canada forward on a path to reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister, and we'll go to the first round, which will consist of Mr. Poilievre, Mr. Fragiskotos, Mr. St. Marie, and Mr. Julian. It'll be 6-minute round, and we'll hold people to that. Mr. Poilievre.
What is the daily cost to the Canadian economy of the current rail blockade?
This is obviously a question that is very important, not only for this committee but for Canadians. We are paying very close consideration to the economic impacts of the situation we're in as we work to negotiate towards a peaceful conclusion.
How much is the daily cost to the Canadian economy?
As you can appreciate, this is a fluid situation, one which we are working together with industry, with Canadians to get ourselves to, as I said, a negotiated situation. And we're watching those impacts, trying to reduce them through discussions and ways that we can actually, relieve the situation as we work through this negotiation.
Do you know the daily cost to the Canadian economy of this rail blockade?
As I think you might know, the impacts are significant on multiple fronts, and they're impacting people individually, as well as individual businesses. And as the situation is very fluid, it's something we're staying on top of, but unable to come to conclusions with that level of precision.
A coalition of business groups say that $500 million of goods are not moving every day as a result of this blockade. But we want to know the real cost of your government's inaction and your unwillingness to enforce the rule of law and bring this illegal blockade to an end. So if you could please send in writing to us the daily costs that our economy is absorbing as a result of your inaction on this issue, we'd really appreciate it. On to the next issue of cost. What would be the cost to all three levels of government of a decision by the federal government to kill the Tech Frontier mine in northern Alberta?
I appreciate the question. The Tech Frontier decision is an important decision. It's obviously gone through a rigorous process, a process that is coming before Cabinet in the near term. And one of the things that we'll be considering is all of the information that's brought forward as we determine the right step forward for Canada.
How much revenues would governments lose if the project did not go forward?
As I said, what we know is important is that we consider the rigorous process, the information that comes to Cabinet, to look at the right decision on this going forward, and we will do that, and it's coming soon.
So you don't know the cost to the governments of killing the Tech Frontier mine. It is reported to be $70 billion that the governments, all three levels, will lose if your government kills this project. You claim that your government has been negotiating with First Nations regarding the blockade. Since the blockade began, has your government met with any of the 20 First Nations communities who whose elected councils have approved and support the Coastal GasLink since the blockade began?
The situation we find ourselves in is obviously one that's extremely challenging. We know that the path forward has to consider our objective, which is to get to a peaceful conclusion that allows our economy to function and respects all parties to this situation.
But yesterday, the Prime Minister's remarks didn't even acknowledge the existence of the 20 First Nations communities who have signed agreements to support the Coastal GasLink. It sounds to me like their voices don't matter to this government. Really harkens back to a sort of a colonialist mentality where the government just ignores people it disagrees with and only talks to those with whom it agrees. Why hasn't your government engaged with those 20 First Nations communities that desperately want this project to go ahead so that they can lift themselves out of poverty and give hope to their young people? Why aren't you engaging with those First Nations communities?
Minister has the floor. Minister, go ahead.
Well, with respect, I wouldn't agree with that characterization. I think that it's important for us to consider all of the parties to this situation, and that includes the peoples engaged themselves, that includes their elected representatives, that includes the hereditary chiefs, that of course includes the businesses that are impacted, and the people across Canada that are impacted by the situation.
So no meetings
so
with
I'm not yet quite finished. So we're not excluding anyone from those discussions, and we will work as hard as we can and in a cooperative fashion to get to a conclusion that will be positive for the people engaged in this and positive for our economy.
Good time. Go ahead.
So we don't know, the minister doesn't know the cost of the blockade per day to the Canadian economy. He doesn't know the cost to governments of blocking the tech frontier mine. He won't tell us if he's engaged with the 20 First Nations communities that actually support the Coastal GasLink. Last question then. The government has already introduced deficits numbers that are much bigger than the numbers published before the election. And these numbers that we now have do not include any of the spending measures that the Liberal Party of Canada put in its electoral platform. When all of those spending promises are implemented, how big will the deficit get?
I think it's an absolutely correct point that that during the election campaign we talked about things, investments that we want to make in Canadians, as all other parties did, by the way, and that's an important part of the electoral process. We're working through our budget right now in order to think about how we can demonstrate fiscal responsibility and how we can assure that Canadians can meet up to affordability challenges. We remain committed to reducing our debt to GDP. You know, we were left by the previous Stephen Harper government that you were part of with a debt to GDP and a rate of unemployment, both of which that were too high, as well as a challenging growth situation. So we've been able to reduce our debt to GDP. We've been able to significantly reduce unemployment, and of course we've been able to increase growth. So we plan on continuing on that path.
Okay, over to Mr. Fragiskotos.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Minister, for being here and the work that you're doing. On the point of deficits, and I know my colleagues have raised such matters in previous meetings through our consultations. Could you tell us your thoughts on what the effects would be on the average Canadian and indeed the wider Canadian economy if in the upcoming budget our government was to immediately move towards balancing the budget in an austerity budget?
Well, I think first of all I would say that it's important for me not to engage in hypotheticals. So I just want to be absolutely clear that we are not thinking about changing our approach. We believe that investing in Canadians is important. We see that the advantage we've created in terms of growth, in terms of unemployment, has been very advantageous for people and for our economy more broadly. Clearly, taking a significant amount out of the economy rapidly would have an impact on growth, a negative impact on growth, and would have a negative impact as a result on things like employment and on things like wage growth. So those the exact implications can be estimated, but we can't get to absolute certainty. But we can absolutely see that there'd be negative growth. There would be negative on employment, and there would be negative on actual income to people. And so it's not a path that we intend to go down.
Okay. In your comments, you talked about the environmental focus of the government. And this is indeed one of the themes of the budget consultations that have been carried out. Mark Carney, as you know, is working on such matters, looking at the economy, looking at the environment, and the shift towards a green economy. I'm just going to read a quote that he recently put forward and get your thoughts. He says as follows: "There will be industries, sectors, and firms that do very well during this process because they will be part of the solution. But there will also be ones that lag behind and they will be punished. Companies that don't adapt will go bankrupt without question." Do you have, can you tell us the work that the government has done and wants to continue doing to help the private sector transition to a green economy in Canada?
I think it's important that we work together as Canadians to ensure that that businesses don't actually face that dire outcome that was predicted. Our goal is to make sure that we have economic growth and that we are able to turn to a cleaner, greener economy that allows our businesses to continue to be successful. So One of the things that I did together with the Minister of Environment last year is started a sustainable finance review that came out with some important recommendations on how we could ensure that companies deal with the ramifications of a climate change, that make sure that they represent their situation so that investors can take appropriate decisions. That will encourage companies, I believe, to take those issues seriously and create a more sustainable path for themselves, and also therefore more sustainable for our country and for the world. So that's an important effort. I think we will continue to think about ways that we can ensure that the companies are moving in the right direction. Certainly putting a price on carbon, what it does is it provides a price method for companies to make the correct decisions. And we also can think about not only sticks but carrots, so things that we can invest in together with other Canadians to get us to a greener future. And that's some of the thinking we're doing right now as we look towards budget 2020.
I've asked a question relating to the private sector when it comes to the environment. I also want to ask you a question that really pertains to our work with municipalities. We heard in our pre-budget consultations at least 4 organizations, including one mayor, the mayor of London, Ontario, came and testified on the need to help municipalities with their transit fleets. They're very interested in electric buses. And I just wanted to put it to you, Minister, what, in your mind, can the federal government do to assist in the transition? Obviously, it's a complex one because there's the necessary charging infrastructure, the buses. This is new technology that we see. There's been a few pilot projects in the past, but nothing en masse. Do you have any thoughts on how the federal government can effectively work with municipalities in this regard as they seek to transition from diesel fleets to electrified fleets?
That's something that I also heard when I met with the mayors a couple of weeks ago as an initiative that they're keen on. It's clearly one that has different impacts for different cities across the country that are in different situations. I think the focus of your work around pre-budget consultations is helping to get those sort of ideas to the fore so that we can analyze them and determine what are the things that we should be trying to invest in that are going to have the biggest impact on reducing our carbon emissions. That is certainly one. I don't have any details on what we might or might not do in the budget yet. It's not appropriate to do that.
That's fine.
But as we think about places to invest, we will be thinking about the biggest opportunity from those investments. And then, of course, in the case of municipalities, we always need to think about how the actual delivery mechanism would work, because we need to work together with provinces and municipalities, and that's something that's forefront in our minds as well. We want to be able to ensure that the desired impact actually happens through the mechanisms that are available to us.
Okay, thank you both. Turning to Mr. St. Marie and then Mr. Julian. Mr. St. Marie.
Oui, merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Hello, Mr. Minister. I'd like to draw your attention to an aspect in your mandate letter that the Prime Minister gave you, and I quote, modernize the anti-avoidance laws to prevent large multinationals from avoiding tax through accounting strategies that are sophisticated between countries. So, in a few words, when I read this, it says, make illegal what's immoral, the legal use of tax havens by large companies. And here I'm referring to what the FMI calls offshore financial centers. In its jurisdictions, these companies pay zero tax or very little, and they use the principle of not being doubly taxed in their sophisticated accounting strategies to avoid paying any tax here. To me, this is a question of tax inequity, and what makes that strategy legal is two subsections 5907 of the tax regulations. One of them is the regulation 5907 subsection 11.2c, which specifies that the exclusion of companies that have a tax advantage in Barbados does not apply, quite simply. So This makes Section 30 of the treaty inoperative, and despite what the Canada-Barbados treaty says, in spite of what the law says, Canadian companies can repatriate the profits from Barbados without paying tax on it. And in 2009, that was added to an appendix of a Budget Implementation Act where the government will insert a section that's called tax credits for medical costs that doesn't even deal with medical tax credits. And there's a proposal for an amendment to the tax regulations that has nothing to do with medical expenses, which is Section 590711 of the regulations that specifies that even if there are information sharing agreements that are not under these treaties, that certain companies protected. If Canada concludes an agreement for a general tax information exchange, it can be retroactive to 2007. So we had about 22 new tax havens and a couple of new ones. Grenada, where the tax rate is 0. And because it's 0, companies don't have to provide tax returns or reports. So there's no information. So what I want to ask you is to answer this aspect of the mandate letter. Are you considering removing those tax regulations that allow legal use of tax havens? And can we expect to see that in the budget? Thank you. That is a question. So as you're aware, it's a very important aspect for our system. We have to make sure our system operates and that the results are fair. As you explained, it's part of my mandate letter to consider how we can assure Canadians that our system operates properly, and we are doing this. We've done a lot over the last 4.5 years. Yes, but we have worked together with other countries like the Common Reporting System with OECD, like the BEPS approach. This is very important because with the changes in our system internationally, we have to do things together or we'll have other problems afterwards. But for more information, I believe that Andrew, who is a taxation professor, can explain our approach more to assure you that the measures that are necessary are being considered this year and also in the coming years, because we have to continue to take measures because the situation is continually changing with companies that find new ways of improving their situation. Thank you for your answer. Before we hear Mr. Marcelin, I would like to remind you that Canada still remains late or behind the times compared to other countries with the OECD proposed measures. So there's much to be done there. And like in the fight against climate change, this will be done with nations collaborating, but we mustn't wait for everything to be solved elsewhere before we act. And I would like to remind you that these two regulations, in my opinion, as they contradict the legislation, they could be quite illegal, but as they've never been disputed, they remain in force. So I encourage you to take a close look at these regulations, and now I can hear the explanations from Mr. Marcelin.
I think it's important, as the Minister indicated, to point out that these are issues that are best approached in a multilateral fashion through the base erosion and profits shifting approach being one aspect of that. I think it's also important to understand the nature of how profits are taxed across countries. For example, Canada, like most other countries, does not tax active business income derived from abroad. But on the other hand, we have a very rigid, very strict approach to taxing investment income abroad, the foreign accrual property income rules. So we've made a number of changes over the recent years, Common Reporting Standard, the multilateral instrument, which essentially addresses treaty shopping issues, but does so in an organized fashion with other countries. And also invested very significant amounts in international audit activity by the Canada Revenue Agency.
We'll have to end it there, Mr. Julian, and then up to Mr. Morantz.
Thanks very much, Minister Morneau, for being here today. You'll recall the last time I questioned you at Finance Committee, we talked about the cost of Trans Mountain Pipeline. And at the time, you indicated that there was no updated construction schedule around Trans Mountain, and that you thought the figures at the time, $7.4 billion, did not need to be updated. Now, subsequently to that, of course, we found out that the construction costs have now ballooned to more than $12 billion, $12.6 billion, including the purchase cost. We're now talking about over $17 billion now, all assumed by the public purse, at the same time as Trans Mountain is losing, after interest charges, you'll agree, about $150 million a year. Now, we had important testimony on February 3rd from your finance officials that said that basically the financing of Trans Mountain on the public dime would occur through the Canada account of the EDC, which is subject to approval from yourself and the Minister of International Trade. So my first question is, what is the limit in terms of what you are prepared to have the taxpayers assume around Trans Mountain? What is the criteria? Because construction costs already, even from the estimate of 2 weeks ago, seem to be increasing. So we could well have other surprises. Secondly, the fact that Trans Mountain has now admitted that construction costs have increased allows the shippers now to pull out with the revised fee schedule. Now, there's only two doors. One is that there's a revised fee schedule, shippers pull out, and the whole Trans Mountain House of Cards collapses. Or the other, of course, is subsidies from the federal government to under support the actual cost of shipping. Is the federal government, is the Ministry of Finance contemplating subsidies to the shippers to keep Trans Mountain afloat? Those are my two questions to start.
Well, thank you. And you started by talking about previous discussions around this table. I think it's important to note that the previous estimates were made by Kinder Morgan, and they were made a number of years ago. The costs that were announced by the company a couple of weeks ago were the costs that they determined based on the status of the project, the time that's gone on from the previous estimate of the previous company, the improved environmental standards, the increased consultations with Indigenous peoples, and the increased benefit agreements that came as a result of that. So there was a significant change, of course, in that, and in a transparent way, the company came forward with their costs.
Sorry, Minister, I only have 6 minutes, so those two questions.
The Minister will have two.
Go ahead, to your more specific questions, we have a process. Of course, the company goes to CDEV around funding, and that funding request then comes through and goes through the Treasury Board, and yes, is funded through the Canada account, like the previous decision of the Conservative government before us around the General Motors happened as well. The shippers' costs, of course, those we have commitments from those shippers in terms of them to picking up the costs as they have the pipeline in play once it's completed. And to your final question, no, the government's not considering any subsidies to shippers.
Thank you. Okay, je vais passer à d'autres questions d'abord.
So I'll move on to other questions now. We've had an answer from the Minister of Finance to questions that we asked a few weeks ago. First of all, on tax havens, it would appear that the Department of Finance does not agree with the estimates that were made by the Parliamentary Budget Officer, even though the Parliamentary Budget Officer spoke about the fact that these tax havens, and that there are huge amounts, $25 billion were mentioned, really goes against the spirit of the legislation on income. And if you do not agree with the number of 25 billion, then what internal numbers do you have at the Finance Department? And secondly, when we refer to drug insurance in your mandate letter, it talks about implementing a universal drug plan. You have the Pharmacare Now Coalition asking for this to be applied. What is the department's assessment to bring in a universal tax, or a universal drug system? Two very different questions. As I said a few minutes ago, to ensure Canadians that our system is fair, we have to keep working with other countries to make sure that companies will not work against us. We work with OECD to improve our situation. And every year, we consider the measures that we can take. For example, now in 2020, we're considering how we can ensure our system will work. So nothing to be said today, but much to be done. Secondly, as we said, the approach for a universal pharmacare system is very important. We have to consider how we can work with the provinces to make sure that we have a true approach that will work in the future. And that's why we will begin with the things we can do together. High-cost drugs for rare diseases is a good example. We'll continue to work with the provinces to find a solution to reduce the cost of drugs and to make sure that each person in our country has the necessary access to drugs. Both aspects are very important, and we are working with my colleagues and, of course, our provincial counterparts.
Mr. Morantz, and then back to Ms. Kortrakis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Minister, I just wanted to see if you could reconcile something for the folks that are watching today. And I know you're fond of talking about, and we would have different views on this, about how Prime Minister Harper handled the economy, and you've made that point over and over and over. But you have to look at yourself as well. And back in the 2015 campaign, you made commitments to voters, as did the Prime Minister, that the budget would be balanced in 2019. I went back last night and I read over some of the personal statements that you uttered. I'm sure you recall making those statements. And as well, in your mandate letter, and the first item in the mandate letter is from the Prime Minister to you, is that you will continue to reduce the government's debt as a function of our economy. So that's number one on the list. So I'm assuming it was very important to the Prime Minister that you maintain that. In the last fiscal update, the debt to GDP ratio actually rose, and that's no longer an anchor that you can lay claim to, at least for the time being. Hopefully you'll improve. But getting back to the issue of the promise, I wonder if you can reconcile this. So the 2019-20 budget originally projected a $19.8 billion deficit. In your update, you said it would be $26.6 billion. I'm just wondering, if you look at, I guess my question is, how do you reconcile what you said and promised personally to the Canadian voters before they actually place their trust in you, and what has actually happened?
Well, thanks, and welcome to this committee. It's the first time we've had the opportunity to work together. These are